story. Cindy had always believed in love, not the fleeting kind that burned bright and disappeared overnight, but the kind built through years of unwavering devotion, compromise, and sacrifice. When she married Daryl, she envisioned a partnership where they would grow together, face hardships together, and ultimately win together. But standing in the dimly lit kitchen, staring at the untouched dinner she had prepared, she felt like a woman clinging to the fading echoes of a dream. Daryl had changed. He was no longer the man who held her close and whispered sweet reassurances when they had nothing but ambition to their names. Now, he barely acknowledged her presence. The nights he spent at home had become fewer, his excuses colder, his attention elsewhere. At first, she convinced herself it was stress, the demands of his growing business. But the heart always knows when it's no longer a priority. The weight of loneliness pressed against her chest as she sat at the dining table, waiting for a man who wouldn't come. When Daryl finally walked in past midnight, his shirt slightly crumpled, the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his skin, Cindy forced herself to suppress the questions clawing at her throat. Instead, she rose quietly, her voice steady but laced with an unspoken plea. "You didn't call." He barely spared her a glance as he loosened his tie, pouring himself a drink. "I was busy." The words stung more than they should have. Busy. Always busy. "I made dinner," she tried again, her heart foolishly hoping for a flicker of guilt in his eyes. He downed his whiskey in one gulp and set the glass down with a dismissive sigh. "I already ate." And just like that, he turned away, leaving her standing alone, like a shadow in her own home. Cindy swallowed hard, her fingers trembling against the cold surface of the dining table. Love was supposed to be about choosing each other every day. But somewhere along the line, Daryl had stopped choosing her. The first time Cindy noticed something was truly wrong, it wasn't through a dramatic revelation. It was in the little things. The forgotten anniversaries, the lingering scent of an unfamiliar floral perfume in their car, the expensive wristwatch she found in the glove compartment, one she never received. But it was the change in his eyes that hurt the most. There was a time Daryl looked at her as if she were his greatest treasure. Now his gaze held nothing. One evening, as she tidied up his office, her fingers brushed against a small velvet box hidden beneath a pile of papers. Her heart leaped, hope momentarily flickering to life. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe he was planning a surprise, an apology for his coldness. But when she opened the box, what stared back at her wasn't meant for her. The necklace was too extravagant, too bold for her simple tastes, and the small card tucked inside with the words, "For my Edith always," made her entire body go numb. Cindy sat frozen, her fingers gripping the delicate chain as 1,000 memories flooded her mind. The late nights, the cold kisses, the way he always shielded his phone. It had never been stress. It had always been her. The realization sent a sharp ache through her chest, but as she sat there in the dim light of his office, something inside her hardened. She heard the sound of the front door unlocking, signaling Daryl's return. He walked in, his face unreadable as he met her gaze. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, his tone irritated, not concerned. Cindy forced herself to breathe, setting the box down carefully. "Who is Edith?" The air in the room thickened as Daryl's expression shifted, not to guilt, not to remorse, but to annoyance. He sighed, rubbing his temple as if she were an inconvenience. "Don't start, Cindy." His voice was low, dismissive, already writing her off. But Cindy wasn't the same woman who had spent years waiting for him to see her, and for the first time she realized she would never be enough for a man who had already replaced her. Cindy's world cracked open like a mirror shattering into a million irreparable shards. Edith. The name sat like venom on her tongue, poisoning every memory she had built with Daryl. And yet, instead of hiding his affair, instead of feeling any semblance of shame, Daryl wore his betrayal like a badge of honor. He didn't even try to deny it. That night Cindy barely slept, her mind restless with unanswered questions. What had she done wrong? What had changed? Had she been so easy to replace? The next morning, she decided she needed proof, not for herself, but because some wounds needed to bleed completely before they could heal. She followed him, her hands trembling as she trailed behind his car, watching as he pulled into a luxury restaurant downtown. Cindy parked at a safe distance, her heart hammering violently as she spotted him through the glass. And there she was, young, glamorous, the kind of woman who thrived on attention. She laughed at something Daryl said, touching his arm intimately, while he leaned closer, whispering things that Cindy used to believe were meant only for her. Her stomach twisted in a way that almost made her sick, but she refused to look away. She needed to see this. She needed to feel every bit of the betrayal. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of her car, walking straight toward them, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Daryl's laughter died instantly when he saw her. Edith, oblivious to the tension, turned to Cindy with a curious smirk. "Oh," she said, tilting her head, "and you are." Cindy's heart clenched, but she stood tall, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm his wife." The words dropped like a bomb between them. Edith's smirk faltered, her eyes widening slightly before she turned to Daryl. "You didn't tell me you were married." Daryl exhaled, leaning back in his seat, completely unfazed. "It's complicated," he said, his tone indifferent, as if their vows meant nothing. And in that moment, something inside Cindy snapped. This wasn't love. This was war. Cindy walked away from the restaurant with unsteady steps, her chest rising and falling as she fought back the lump forming in her throat. Daryl hadn't even tried to hide it. He had sat there, sipping expensive wine with his mistress, acting as if she were nothing more than an uninvited guest to his new, exciting life. How had it come to this? A decade ago, they were just two young dreamers, holding hands through their struggles, whispering promises under the stars. Now she was nothing but an afterthought, discarded in favor of a younger, shinier replacement. The thought made her stomach churn. But humiliation wasn't the worst part. It was the realization that Daryl no longer respected her. He hadn't even looked guilty. Instead, he had smirked at Edith like she was some prize he had won, while Cindy stood there, barely breathing, trying to keep her heart from shattering in a room full of people who watched her fall apart. The pity in their eyes had burned the most. Later that night, Cindy lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like a stranger in her own marriage. Daryl had come home late, smelling like expensive cologne and arrogance. He didn't even try to hide it anymore. When she confronted him, his response was chillingly nonchalant. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" he said, tossing his jacket onto the chair as if this was just another routine argument. Cindy's fingers clenched into fists. "Because I'm your wife," she shot back, her voice trembling. Daryl exhaled slowly, rolling his eyes. "And what do you want me to do, Cindy? Pretend I'm happy? Pretend you and I are still the same?" His words sliced through her like a jagged blade. Pretend. Had their marriage become nothing more than a lifeless performance to him? Cindy sucked in a shaky breath, her nails digging into her palms. "And why don't you just leave?" she whispered, voice barely above a breath. Daryl's smirk was cruel, his eyes gleaming with something close to amusement. "Because, Cindy," he leaned in slightly, "you're still useful." Cindy sat in stunned silence, Daryl's words ringing in her ears long after he had gone to bed. Useful. That was all she was to him now, a convenience, a placeholder, a woman who existed merely to serve his needs while he indulged in someone else. The next morning, the bitterness of his insult still clung to her skin as she moved through the motions of daily life, her body present, but her soul distant. She barely touched her breakfast, staring blankly at the coffee swirling in her mug. When Carol called to check on her, Cindy hesitated before answering, knowing that her friend would hear the hurt in her voice. "Cindy, what's wrong?" Carol's voice was gentle, but laced with concern. Cindy let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "He called me useful," she whispered, her fingers tightening around the phone. Silence stretched between them before Carol exhaled sharply. "That's it," she said firmly. "You're leaving. I don't care if I have to drag you out myself." Cindy swallowed hard, her throat thick with emotion. Leaving? The thought had crossed her mind before, but something had always held her back, fear, love, or maybe just the weight of the years they had spent together. But that night, fate made the decision for her. She walked into the study to retrieve some paperwork and overheard Daryl laughing with his friends on the phone. She should have left, should have spared herself the pain. But the moment she heard her name, Her feet refused to move. Cindy, Daryl's voice was dripping with mockery. She was just a stepping stone. I needed stability, and she was dumb enough to give it to me. Now, she's just there existing. Cindy's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the doorframe, nausea rising in her stomach as Daryl's laughter echoed in the room. Everything hurt. The years, the sacrifices, the love, it had all been meaningless to him. She wanted to storm in, to scream, to make him feel an ounce of the pain clawing at her chest. But instead, something inside her shattered so completely that all she felt was cold clarity. Daryl had no idea what was coming. Cindy sat alone in their dimly lit bedroom, staring at the closet that housed the memories of a life she no longer recognized. She had wasted enough time. The moment she heard Daryl's cruel laughter, something inside her hardened, turning her love into something unrecognizable, a quiet storm, brewing, waiting. She thought about the nights she stayed up late, helping him build his empire, the days she put her dreams on hold, choosing to believe in his vision instead of hers. And this was how he repaid her. Like an old, discarded book on a dusty shelf? No, not anymore. Cindy rose from the bed, her movements slow but deliberate. She would not let him see her break. Instead, she would rise so high that the day he realized her worth, it would be too late. With trembling fingers, she pulled a suitcase from the closet, her heart pounding as she began folding her clothes. The sound of the zipper closing felt like the final nail in the coffin of her marriage. She glanced at herself in the mirror, taking in the reflection of a woman she no longer recognized. This wasn't the Cindy who begged for scraps of attention. This wasn't the woman who waited for her husband to come home, only to be met with indifference. No, this was a woman about to rewrite her story. When Daryl walked into the room, pausing at the sight of the packed bag, he let out a cold chuckle. "Oh, come on," he drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "Where are you going? You won't last a week without me." Cindy turned to him, her expression unreadable. "We'll see about that," she said quietly. And with that, she walked past him, leaving behind not just a house, but a past that no longer deserved her presence. Cindy stood at the doorway of the home she had built with Daryl, her grip tightening around the handle of her suitcase. This wasn't just a house. It was a graveyard of broken promises, a museum of her sacrifices, a place where she had lost herself one painful day at a time, but no more. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like armor. Daryl was still sprawled on the couch, watching the sports channel with his feet propped up, completely indifferent to the fact that his wife, the woman who had given him everything, was leaving. "So, you're really doing this?" he asked lazily, his gaze not even bothering to meet hers. Cindy let out a quiet breath, surprised that there was no anger left in her, no resentment, only exhaustion. "Yes." Daryl finally turned his head, an amused smirk playing at his lips. "And where exactly do you think you'll go, Cindy?" He stretched his arms, as if this were some petty argument that would blow over. "You have no job, no money, no connections. What happens when reality hits?" Cindy met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no fear. She wasn't walking away in anger. She was walking away in certainty. "Then I'll build myself up from nothing," she said quietly, "like I helped you build everything you have." A flicker of something, unease, maybe even regret, flashed in Daryl's eyes before he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, shifting his attention back to the TV. Cindy let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. The real mistake was believing he would ever change. Without another word, she stepped outside, letting the heavy door click shut behind her. As she walked down the pathway, each step felt lighter than the last. For the first time in years, she wasn't just existing. She was choosing herself, and it was only the beginning. The city lights blurred as Cindy sat in the back seat of Carol's car, her fingers gripping the edges of her coat as the cool night air seeped through the slightly cracked window. Carol, always the fierce protector, stole glances at her from the driver's seat, her lips pressed into a thin line as if debating whether to speak. "You don't have to be strong with me, you know," Carol finally said, her voice softer than usual. Cindy inhaled sharply, forcing a smile she didn't quite feel. "I'm fine," Carol scoffed, shaking her head. "No, you're surviving. That's different." Silence stretched between them, the weight of the night pressing heavy on Cindy's chest. She wasn't naive. Starting over would not be easy. But what terrified her more than anything was the emptiness Daryl had left behind. Not because she missed him, but because she had spent so many years defining herself through him. And now she had to learn who Cindy was without him. Carol pulled up to her apartment complex, shutting off the engine before turning to face her. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "You are more than Daryl's wife. You always have been. And I don't care how long it takes, but you're going to prove to him, to yourself, that walking away was the best thing you ever did." Cindy swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding slowly. As she stepped into Carol's apartment, she felt a strange mix of grief and relief settle over her. She had left behind years of pain, but now came the hardest part, rebuilding. Cindy set her suitcase down, exhaling deeply. She had nothing but herself now. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The first morning in Carol's apartment felt surreal. Cindy woke up to the unfamiliar scent of lavender instead of Daryl's cologne, the sound of distant city traffic instead of the deafening silence that had filled their home. It was different, unsettling even, but it was hers. She stretched, blinking at the soft light streaming through the curtains, before pulling herself out of bed. Today was day one of her new life. She found Carol in the kitchen, already brewing coffee, her expression unreadable as she slid a mug toward Cindy. "So, what's the plan?" Cindy wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, letting the heat ground her. "I need a job," she said simply. Carol nodded approvingly. "Good, because I made some calls." Cindy's brows furrowed in surprise. "You did what?" Carol smirked. "I reached out to some people. There's an opening at an investment firm, not high up, but it's a start. Pays well enough to get you on your feet." Cindy exhaled slowly. Her pride wanted to refuse, but pride wouldn't put food on the table. Later that afternoon, Cindy found herself standing in front of a sleek glass building, her palms damp with nerves. She hadn't been in the workforce for years, not since she sacrificed her career to support Daryl's ambitions. Now, she was starting from the ground up, with nothing but sheer determination. She straightened her shoulders, stepping inside. The interview was intense, her resume scrutinized, her long gap in employment questioned. But Cindy didn't back down. She spoke with confidence, with a fire she didn't know she still had. When she walked out of the office, her heart pounded as she checked her phone. A message from Carol waiting. "How did it go?" Cindy took a deep breath, her lips curling into a small, genuine smile for the first time in a long time. "I think I got the job." The official divorce papers arrived on a Friday morning, neatly stacked in a manila envelope, resting on Carol's kitchen counter like a final nail in the coffin of Cindy's past. She stared at them for a long moment, her fingers grazing the edges, feeling the weight of every page. This was it. The finality of it should have made her feel something: pain, anger, regret. But as she sat down, carefully unfolding the documents, she realized she felt nothing but clarity. Daryl had filed without hesitation, without so much as a phone call, as if she had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his life. And maybe she had been, to him. Cindy picked up the pen Carol had left beside the envelope and exhaled. "Are you ready?" Carol asked softly, watching her with cautious eyes. Cindy glanced at her best friend before nodding. "I've been ready for a long time. I just didn't know it." The pen felt heavier than it should as she signed her name, but each stroke of ink felt like taking her power back. She imagined Daryl, probably sitting in his office, his feet propped up on his desk, barely glancing at the same papers, eager to rid himself of a woman he had long stopped valuing. But he didn't know. He didn't know that the woman he was divorcing wasn't the same one he had walked all over for years. She was stronger now, sharper, and she had no intention of fading into the background. "It's done," she said, closing the envelope and pushing it away from her like it no longer held any power over her. Carol grinned, lifting her coffee mug in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," she said. Cindy met her gaze, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. "To never looking back." Cindy stood in front of the mirror, examining the woman staring back at her. For the first time in years, she didn't see a neglected wife, a discarded afterthought. She saw herself. Gone were the dull, shapeless clothes she used to wear, the ones that made her blend into the background. Instead, she now dressed with intention, fitted blouses, elegant heels, bold lip colors that made her feel visible. Her hair, once left to fall in tired waves, was now styled in sleek, confident curls. She was finally reclaiming herself. But it wasn't just about appearance, it was about mindset. At work, she was no longer hesitant, no longer afraid to use her voice. She walked into meetings with her head high, her presence commanding, and within weeks, she had already proven herself as more than just a woman returning to the workforce. She was a force. The real test came when she was invited to a networking event, a room filled with powerful investors, business moguls, and the kind of people who once dismissed her as just a wife. Carol had practically shoved her into the event, whispering, "You belong here, and it's time people see that." As Cindy entered the grand ballroom, heads turned, whispers followed. She looked unrecognizable. And then, just as she was accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, she saw him, Daryl. Standing across the room, his arm draped over Edith's shoulders, laughing at something one of his colleagues had said. But then his gaze landed on her, and for the first time in his life, Cindy watched Daryl freeze. Daryl's eyes widened, his casual stance stiffening as he took her in, the elegance of her dress, the effortless way she carried herself, the quiet power in her expression. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Edith, noticing his distraction, followed his gaze before her lips curled in mild annoyance. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Daryl swallowed, his fingers tightening around his drink. "That's Cindy." The name felt foreign in his mouth, as if he hadn't expected to ever speak it again. Edith scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "She certainly had a glow-up," she muttered. But Cindy didn't spare them another glance. She had already won. She had spent years wondering what it would feel like to be seen, to be acknowledged by the man who once treated her as invisible. But standing there, she realized she no longer needed his validation. As the night progressed, Cindy moved through the room with effortless grace, engaging in conversations with people who once overlooked her. She was no longer Daryl's wife. She was Cindy, confident, ambitious, and completely untouchable. And then, as she was laughing at a joke Morris, the investor she had recently impressed, had made, Daryl appeared beside her. "Cindy," he said, his voice uncertain, like a man who had lost something he didn't realize was valuable until it was gone. She turned, raising an eyebrow as if seeing him was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Daryl," she responded smoothly. His throat bobbed as he studied her. "You look different." Cindy tilted her head, offering a polite but distant smile. "And you look exactly the same." The words weren't meant to be cruel, but they landed like a slap, because Cindy was no longer the woman he could reduce to nothing. And deep down, Daryl knew it. Cindy left the event with her head held high, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors as if announcing her newfound power. The world had finally seen her, and more importantly, Daryl had seen her. But as much as his stunned expression had momentarily satisfied a part of her, she refused to let her success be about him. She wasn't here to prove anything to Daryl. She was here to prove something to herself. The next morning, she sat in her new office, fingers poised over her laptop as she finalized a proposal that would determine the next phase of her career. The company had underestimated her at first, assuming she was just another woman trying to get back into the corporate world after a failed marriage. But Cindy was not just trying, she was excelling. Her ideas were bold, innovative, and impossible to ignore. And today, she was about to present a strategy that would put her name at the top of the game. Morris had been watching her closely for weeks, his sharp eyes catching every detail of her work ethic. "You've done your homework," he said as he flipped through her proposal, nodding in approval. "This is impressive, Cindy." She exhaled softly, masking the nervous excitement in her chest. "I believe in this project," she said simply. Morris chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I can see that. And I think you're ready to take the lead on this." Cindy blinked, stunned. "Lead?" she repeated, hardly believing what she was hearing. "I was expecting to assist, not—" Morris waved a hand dismissively. "Cindy, you've already proven yourself. You're not just some assistant. You're a leader. Own it." Cindy swallowed hard, realization dawning on her. This was her moment. The beginning of something bigger than she had ever imagined. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she truly belonged here. While Cindy thrived in her newfound success, cracks had already begun forming in Daryl's perfect world. The same Edith he once flaunted like a trophy was slowly revealing the reality Cindy had predicted all along. She wasn't built for struggle. What had once been effortless charm between them was now a series of unmet expectations, petty arguments, and financial strain. Edith had expected luxury, but Daryl's recent business struggles had started tightening the grip on his once extravagant lifestyle. "Daryl, this is ridiculous," Edith huffed one evening, tossing a credit card onto the coffee table. It got declined again. "What's going on?" Daryl rubbed his temples, exhaustion weighing on him. "It's just a temporary cash flow issue," he muttered. "The business took a hit last quarter, but I'll fix it." Edith's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the couch impatiently. "Fix it? You said that last month." She folded her arms, her irritation clear. "I didn't sign up for this." Daryl's jaw tightened. "No, you signed up for a free ride," he snapped before he could stop himself. Edith's eyes widened in disbelief before narrowing dangerously. "Excuse me?" she said in a low, threatening voice. "Don't act like you didn't know what this was," he shot back, rising to his feet. "You wanted money, status, a life you didn't have to work for. And now that things aren't as easy, you're suddenly unhappy." Edith scoffed, shaking her head. "You really think I'm going to sit around and struggle with you? I didn't leave my options open for nothing." The words hit him harder than expected. Daryl had always thought he was in control, that Edith was his prize. But now he was starting to see the truth. He was disposable. And for the first time since Cindy left, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Cindy had barely stepped out of her office building when she spotted him. Daryl stood by his car, his usual confidence stripped away, replaced by something that almost looked like regret. Cindy kept walking, pretending she hadn't seen him, but he stepped directly into her path. "Cindy," he said, his voice uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether she would acknowledge him. She exhaled sharply, tilting her head as she studied him. There was something different about him now. His suit wasn't as sharp. The arrogance in his posture was dimmed. She raised a perfectly arched brow. "Daryl." He shifted on his feet, the silence stretching between them. "You're doing well," he finally said, the words tasting unfamiliar in his mouth. Cindy let out a small, amused chuckle. "I know. There was no need for false modesty. She had worked hard for every ounce of success she had now." Daryl ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Look, Cindy, I wanted to say that I didn't expect things to turn out like this." Cindy crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Like what?" she asked, feigning curiosity. Daryl exhaled, as if struggling to find the words. "Like you, winning," he admitted, his voice low. Cindy's lips curled into a slow smile. "That's the difference between you and me, Daryl," she said, stepping closer. "You thought my value ended when you walked away. But I was never just your wife. I was always more. You just never bothered to see it." Daryl opened his mouth, but no words came out. And before he could formulate a response, Cindy walked away, leaving him standing there, watching, as she disappeared into the world he once thought she could never survive in. Daryl sat in his dimly lit office, fingers gripping the edge of his desk as frustration brewed in his chest. It wasn't just Cindy's success that unnerved him. It was how effortlessly she had stepped into a world he never thought she could navigate without him. He had convinced himself that once she left, she would struggle, beg for his help, realize she wasn't built for independence. But instead, Cindy had become something he barely recognized, confident, thriving, and most of all, untouchable. The worst part. Everyone else saw it too. His business associates, the same men who once dismissed her as Daryl's quiet wife, now spoke of her in admiration, discussing her deals, her sharp intellect, her rising influence in the industry. "She's really making a name for herself," one of his colleagues had remarked at a recent dinner. Daryl had clenched his jaw, pretending to be unaffected, but inside, the bitterness gnawed at him. He had never expected to miss her, but now it felt like a slow, suffocating realization. His mood worsened when he arrived at a networking event a few days later, only to see Cindy enter the venue with Morris by her side. Dressed in elegance, she commanded attention without trying. It was the way she moved, the way she held conversations, the way men, powerful men, were drawn to her presence. Daryl watched as she laughed at something Morris whispered in her ear, her expression warm, easy, the way it had once been with him. Something primal twisted in his chest, a surge of regret and something dangerously close to jealousy. He had thrown her away so carelessly, never once believing she could be more than what he allowed. And now, she had outgrown him completely. "You're staring," Edith muttered beside him, her voice sharp. Daryl blinked, tearing his gaze away from Cindy. "No, I'm not," he lied. But the truth was he couldn't stop. The cracks in Daryl's life had started small, overlooked business deals, tension in boardrooms, Edith's increasing demands for money he no longer had in excess. But now they were becoming impossible to ignore. Investors were pulling back, questioning his leadership, whispering doubts about his judgment. The once flourishing company he had built with Cindy's unwavering support was now struggling under his reckless decisions, his distractions, and his refusal to adapt. But what truly sent him spiraling was Edith. She had grown restless, her patience wearing thin as Daryl failed to maintain the extravagant lifestyle she had expected. "I didn't sign up for this," she snapped one evening, arms folded as she leaned against their kitchen counter. "You promised me a better life, not a downgraded one." Daryl's head throbbed as he massaged his temples. "We hit a rough patch, that's all. It'll pass." Edith let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "You don't get it, do you? You're not the man I thought you were. You're just ordinary." The insult landed harder than he wanted to admit. Daryl lifted his gaze, eyes narrowing. "Oh, and what are you? A gold digger with an expiration date." Edith smirked, unfazed. "You're damn right I am, and my expiration date with you. It's up." She slid a set of keys across the counter, her gaze filled with icy finality. "I've found someone who actually knows how to keep up with me." Daryl's stomach dropped as realization set in. She was leaving. He had traded his wife for this woman, abandoned everything he and Cindy built for someone who was now discarding him like an unwanted accessory. "You'll regret this," he bit out, his voice tight with anger. Edith grabbed her designer purse, rolling her eyes. "No, Daryl, you will." And with that she walked out, just as easily as she had walked in. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. Daryl stared at the empty space where Edith's belongings had once cluttered the room, feeling an unfamiliar weight press against his chest. It wasn't love that he had lost, it was control. He had prided himself on always being in command, always calling the shots. But first Cindy had walked away, and now Edith had followed, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his choices. He reached for his phone, scrolling through old messages from Cindy, messages from a time when she still cared, when she still loved him. He had been her entire world, and he had destroyed that without a second thought. Regret was a slow, creeping poison, and now it was settling deep into his bones. As if fate wasn't done punishing him, the final blow came later that evening. News broke that Edith had not only left him, but had aligned herself with one of his business rivals. Photos surfaced online, her arm linked with another man, her lips painted with the same smug smirk she once wore around him. She had played him, and the world knew it. The embarrassment was crushing. Investors who were already wary of him saw the headlines and pulled back further, questioning his stability, his decision-making. "He can't even keep his personal life together," someone had remarked in a meeting earlier that day. Daryl clenched his fists, his breathing shallow. He was losing everything. And the worst part, Cindy was watching it all unfold from a throne he had never thought she would sit on. Daryl sat in his office, staring at the financial reports spread out before him, but the numbers blurred together, meaningless against the crushing weight in his chest. His empire was crumbling. Deals were slipping through his fingers, partners were withdrawing their support, and investors were raising concerns about his leadership. His once thriving business, the very thing he had built his life around, was now on the verge of collapse. But none of it compared to the sinking realization that had settled deep in his bones. He had lost Cindy, not just physically, but in a way that was irreversible. The woman he had underestimated, belittled, and cast aside had become something greater than he ever imagined. And now, as he watched her career flourish, her confidence soar, and her presence dominate the very circles he once controlled, he was forced to accept the harsh truth: she had outgrown him. He rubbed his temple, exhaling a slow, shaky breath. "You're distracted," his assistant noted cautiously. Daryl lifted his gaze, meeting her concerned expression. "What's wrong?" He let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "What's wrong?" he repeated, voice laced with exhaustion. "Everything." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "You ever make a mistake so big that, by the time you realize it, it's too late to fix it?" His assistant hesitated before responding. "Are you talking about the company?" Daryl exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. The company was failing, yes. But the real failure, the one that haunted him the most, was Cindy. The way she had looked at him at that event, so indifferent, so untouched by his presence. It was as if he had never mattered. "Forget it," he muttered, waving off her concern. But deep down he knew the truth. He had made the biggest mistake of his life, and now he was paying for it. The official court date for the divorce was set, and Cindy received the notification in her office, the email subject line feeling both final and freeing. She stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle over her. This was it. The last tie binding her to Daryl would soon be cut, and there would be nothing left between them. No shared home, no obligations, no painful history weighing her down. She tapped her nails against the desk, reading through the legal documents carefully. There was no fight from Daryl, no last-minute plea to reconsider. But Cindy had expected that. Men like him never realize the depth of their losses until it's too late. "It's real now, huh?" Morris's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up, finding him leaning against the doorframe, his gaze unreadable. Cindy nodded, exhaling. "It's been real for a long time," she admitted. He studied her for a moment before stepping inside, lowering himself into the chair across from her desk. "Are you ready for it?" he asked. Cindy met his gaze, her lips curving into a slow, confident smile. More than ready. She wasn't sad. She wasn't angry. She was empowered. The woman Daryl had taken for granted was gone, replaced by someone he would never be able to touch again. She had built a life without him, and she had no regrets. Morris tilted his head, a hint of admiration in his expression. "You know, I don't think he fully understands what's coming." Cindy let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, he will," she murmured. "And when he does, it'll be far too late." Daryl's footsteps echoed against the polished floors of his penthouse, the vast emptiness of the space amplifying the silence. He had everything, yet nothing. His business, once thriving, now stood on shaky ground. His personal life, a complete wreck. Edith was gone. His so-called friends had distanced themselves, and now the final blow was set to land, the divorce. He had convinced himself for weeks that Cindy would break down before the final court date, that she would hesitate, that she would show up with the same quiet devotion she always had. But the Cindy he once knew no longer existed. He had seen it in her eyes, in her posture, in the way she walked through the world now, as if she had been reborn from the ashes of the life he had burned down. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling inside him. Had she really moved on? Did he really mean nothing to her now? The thought festered in his mind until he found himself reaching for his phone, scrolling through old messages, old photos, anything to remind himself that there had once been a time when she had loved him. His fingers hovered over her contact before his pride kicked in. What would he even say? That he was sorry? That he regretted everything? He scoffed at himself, tossing the phone onto the table. It was too late for apologies. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't the one walking away. She was. And on the day of the divorce, when she would arrive in a way that would shake his world, he would finally understand the depth of his mistake. But by then, it would be far too late. The courthouse buzzed with murmurs. Reporters stationed just outside the entrance, sensing the significance of this high-profile divorce. Daryl had expected a quiet, simple process, a final formality before he could move on completely. But as he adjusted his cufflinks and strode toward the entrance, His confidence was abruptly shattered by the low hum of approaching engines. He turned just as a fleet of black luxury cars pulled up, their tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. The entire atmosphere shifted. Whispers grew louder, cameras flashed, and then the moment that would haunt him forever unfolded before his eyes. Cindy stepped out, dressed in an exquisite, form-fitting designer gown, exuding an aura of power and grace. She didn't just walk, she commanded. Flanked by a team of highly influential executives, including Morris, she was the picture of a woman who had not just survived, but thrived. Daryl felt his throat tighten, his pulse hammering as the weight of her transformation crashed down on him. She wasn't the quiet, obedient wife he had once discarded. She was someone far greater than he had ever imagined. She barely acknowledged him as she walked past, her expression unreadable, her gaze fixed ahead as if he no longer existed. The symbolism of it hit him like a freight train. She was the one walking away. A man like him, who once prided himself on control, was now rendered powerless. "Cindy," he finally managed, his voice betraying the unease crawling under his skin. She paused for half a second, just long enough for their eyes to meet, before offering him a slow, knowing smile. "Daryl," she said smoothly, as if saying his name was nothing more than a trivial courtesy. Then, with absolute finality, she walked into the courthouse, leaving him frozen in place. Inside the courtroom, the legal proceedings went by swiftly, but Daryl wasn't paying attention. He was watching Cindy. Every time she moved, every time she answered a question with a calm, unwavering voice, he realized just how much he had lost. She had become something more, something untouchable. The realization was suffocating. For years, he had assumed that if she ever left, she would be nothing without him. But she had rewritten her own destiny. His fingers curled against the polished wooden table, a sharp contrast to the loosened grip he had once had on her life. As the judge confirmed the dissolution of their marriage, Daryl did something he had never done before. He panicked. As soon as the court adjourned, he strode toward her, grabbing her wrist just before she exited the room. "Cindy, wait," he said, his voice lower, almost urgent. She turned slowly, raising an elegant brow, her expression unreadable. "Yes," he swallowed, his confidence wavering under the weight of her indifference. I just wanted to say." He trailed off, searching for words that should have come years ago. An apology, a plea, a pathetic attempt to undo what had already been sealed in fate. Cindy exhaled softly, freeing her wrist from his grip, her voice gentle but final. "Whatever you have to say, Daryl, it doesn't matter anymore." He flinched at the brutal truth in her words. "I was wrong," he admitted, desperation flickering in his gaze. "I know I was. He shook his head, exhaling harshly. "I didn't think you'd actually leave." Cindy tilted her head slightly, as if studying a man she no longer recognized. "That was your first mistake," she said simply, "and your biggest one." Without another glance, she turned and walked away, never looking back. As Cindy stepped outside, the world was waiting for her. Cameras clicked, reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and yet she remained poised, exuding the aura of a woman who had just won her greatest battle. Morris was by her side, a silent pillar of support, but Cindy no longer needed saving. She had saved herself. She turned to her lawyer, shaking hands with gratitude, knowing this wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. For the first time in years, she was truly free. Behind her, Daryl stood at the courthouse steps, watching the life he once controlled slip through his fingers. He had always thought she would be the one left broken, the one struggling to pick up the pieces. But now it was him. The empire he had once prided himself on was failing. The woman he had betrayed had become more powerful than he ever imagined, and the weight of his mistakes had never felt heavier. He wanted to scream, to demand another chance, to make her see that he wasn't as invincible as he had once pretended to be. But deep down, he knew Cindy was done with him. And for the first time, he truly understood what he had thrown away. As she stepped into the sleek black car waiting for her, she didn't even glance his way. Daryl clenched his fists, watching as the door shut, sealing the final chapter of their story. As the convoy of luxury cars disappeared down the road, taking Cindy into a future where he no longer existed, Daryl was left standing in the ruins of his own choices. And in that moment he realized He had lost the best thing that had ever happened to him. Edith had always believed she was untouchable. She thrived on power, on status, on being the woman who had replaced Cindy. But what she never expected was the abrupt fall from grace that was now crashing down upon her. The same elite circles that once welcomed her with open arms had begun whispering behind her back. Word had spread. Daryl was no longer the man he once was. His business was crumbling, his influence dwindling, and his wealth, what had once made him desirable, was vanishing before her very eyes. Edith had never cared for love. She had cared for power, and now she was stuck at the side of a man who could no longer provide the luxuries she once demanded. "You need to fix this," she hissed one evening, throwing a pile of overdue bills onto the table. Daryl, disheveled and irritable, rubbed his temples, refusing to meet her gaze. "Do you think I don't know that?" he snapped. "I'm working on it." Edith let out a humorless laugh, crossing her arms. "Working on it? Daryl, we are drowning. Your investors are pulling out. Your name is a joke in the industry. And meanwhile, Cindy is out there thriving while we're stuck scrambling to keep up appearances." Daryl flinched at Cindy's name, but Edith saw the hesitation in his eyes. He was still thinking about her, regretting her, missing her. The realization stung more than she cared to admit. "You still want her, don't you?" she accused, her voice laced with venom. Daryl exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter what I want," he muttered. "She's gone," Edith scoffed, grabbing her purse. "Well, so am I," she spat. "I have no intention of sinking with you." Daryl's head snapped up, but before he could stop her, she was already gone, walking out just as effortlessly as she had walked in, leaving him to face the wreckage alone. Cindy stood at the balcony of her penthouse, the city lights stretching out before her like a canvas of endless possibilities. This was her life now, one she had built without Daryl, without sacrifice, without shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's world. She had not just survived the divorce, she had thrived beyond it. The company she had poured herself into was flourishing, her investments were expanding, and most importantly, she had rediscovered herself. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, finding Morris leaning against the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're doing it again," he teased, "staring out at the world like you're plotting something." Cindy chuckled, crossing her arms. "Maybe I am," she admitted. "I've spent so many years thinking about the past, and now I'm thinking about the future." Morris stepped forward, tilting his head slightly. "And what does your future look like?" Cindy inhaled deeply, allowing herself to truly consider the question. "It looks limitless," she said, her voice steady. "For the first time, I'm not afraid. I'm not waiting for someone else to decide my worth. I know who I am now." Morris smiled, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. "And you have no idea how powerful that makes you." Cindy met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than necessary. She had been so focused on reclaiming herself that she hadn't considered what came next. But maybe, just maybe, there was room for something new, something real. She didn't need saving, but she was finally ready to let someone stand beside her. Daryl sat alone in the dimly lit bar, staring at the glass of whiskey in front of him, the bitter taste doing little to numb the ache in his chest. It wasn't the alcohol that burned, it was the realization of everything he had lost. He had spent years believing that power made him untouchable, that he could discard people and move on without consequence. But now, as he watched the news highlight Cindy's latest success, as he heard whispers of her growing empire, he felt the sharp sting of regret settle deep in his bones. She had won, and it wasn't out of revenge, it wasn't to spite him, it was because she had always been meant for more, and he had been too blind to see it. He had traded a diamond for dust, and now he was the one left in the ruins. The final blow came when he heard her name at the bar. Cindy Adams. A group of businessmen were discussing her, admiration evident in their voices. "She's incredible, sharp, fearless, completely transformed the industry. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if she surpasses every major player in the next few years." Daryl clenched his jaw, gripping his glass tighter. "She's hosting a gala next weekend," another man chimed in. "I heard Morris is going to be there with her." Daryl's stomach twisted. Morris, the man who had stood by Cindy's side when she needed support, the man who had watched her rise while Daryl had laughed at her. He had lost Cindy, not just as a wife, but as a woman who had ever belonged to him. And for the first time, Daryl truly understood some mistakes can never be undone. The night of the gala arrived, and Cindy stood before the full-length mirror in her penthouse, adjusting the delicate clasp of her diamond bracelet. This night wasn't just another event, it was a statement. A declaration to the world that she was no longer the woman defined by her past, but one who had built an empire from the ashes of betrayal. The navy blue silk gown hugged her curves with effortless elegance, the soft shimmer of its fabric catching the light with every movement. Tonight, she would stand before the very people who had once dismissed her, and they would see not a woman scorned, but a woman reborn. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts, and when she opened it, Morris stood there, his gaze sweeping over her before settling into an appreciative smile. "You look." He paused, shaking his head slightly, as if words couldn't quite capture it. "Powerful." Cindy chuckled, stepping back to let him in. "I was going for unforgettable." Morris extended his arm, and without hesitation, Cindy slid her hand through the crook of his elbow. "Then let's make sure they never forget you," he murmured, leading her out. The gala was a spectacle of wealth and prestige, yet as Cindy stepped into the grand hall, all eyes turned to her. The whispers were inevitable, murmurs of admiration, curiosity, and from a few, envy. But Cindy didn't care. She had spent too long living in the shadows of someone else's world. This was her world now. Throughout the evening, Morris stayed by her side, an anchor in a sea of unfamiliar faces. And when they shared a quiet moment on the balcony, Cindy realized something. For the first time, she wasn't just standing on her own, she was standing with someone who saw her for who she truly was. "You could have anyone, Cindy," Morris said, his voice laced with something deeper than admiration. "But I'd be lying if I said I didn't hope you'd choose me." Cindy met his gaze, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "I'm done choosing people who don't choose me back," she murmured. And for the first time, she allowed herself to lean into something new, something real. Daryl hadn't wanted to attend the gala, but his curiosity got the best of him. Or maybe it was something deeper, something close to desperation. He arrived late, his presence barely noticed among the influential crowd that once flocked to him. He was no longer the man people whispered about in admiration. Now, he was just another face in the background, a man who had let everything slip through his fingers. As he nursed his drink at the far end of the hall, his gaze was drawn, as it always was these days, to Cindy. She moved through the room like she belonged there, because now she did. The woman he had once dismissed as useful was now a force, and every person in the room knew it. His stomach twisted when he saw Morris beside her, the way they laughed, the way she looked at him, the way she had once looked at Daryl. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. This was karma, the consequences of his own arrogance unfolding before his eyes. He had spent years treating Cindy like she was disposable, and now he was the one no one needed. Investors he had once commanded barely spared him a glance, while Cindy, the woman he had thought would crumble without him, was now the one they were desperate to impress. He couldn't take it anymore. He strode toward her, past the curious stares, stopping just a few feet away. Cindy turned at the sound of his voice, the barest flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Daryl," she said evenly. He swallowed hard. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even indifferent. She simply didn't care. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Cindy tilted her head, studying him for a long moment before exhaling. "There's nothing left to say." The finality in her voice cut deeper than any insult ever could. She turned away, returning to Morris, to the life that no longer included him. And in that moment, Daryl knew he had lost Cindy forever. Cindy watched the city skyline from the balcony of her penthouse, a glass of wine resting between her fingers, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. She had done it. She had reclaimed herself, rebuilt a life that no longer carried the weight of someone else's neglect. And the best part, she hadn't needed revenge. She hadn't needed to destroy Daryl, hadn't needed to play petty games or prove anything to anyone. Her success had been the only retribution necessary. She had risen, not because of spite, but because she was meant to. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and when she turned, Morris stood there, his gaze warm. You looked like you were having a moment, he said, stepping onto the balcony beside her. Cindy chuckled. I was just thinking, she admitted, about how far I've come. Morris leaned against the railing, his gaze thoughtful. And what's next for you, Cindy Adams? She took a slow sip of her wine, her lips curling into a confident smile. Anything I want, Morris grinned. Then I hope I get to be part of it. Cindy turned to face him fully, holding his gaze for a long moment. She had spent so much of her life waiting, waiting to be loved, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be seen. But she wasn't waiting anymore. She reached out, lacing her fingers with his. Then don't just hope, Morris, she said softly. Be part of it. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a slow kiss to her knuckles. Gladly. As they stood there, overlooking the city that now belonged to her, Cindy knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was only the beginning. And the best revenge had never been destroying Daryl. It had been living a life so extraordinary, he would always regret not being part of it. Here's the Bible verse for the story. Proverbs 11 verse 8. The righteous person is rescued from trouble, and it falls on the wicked instead. Explanation. This verse perfectly aligns with Cindy's journey. She suffered betrayal and humiliation at the hands of Daryl, but instead of seeking revenge through bitterness, she chose to rebuild herself. In the end, the trouble that was meant for her fell on Daryl instead, while she was elevated beyond what anyone imagined. Moral of the story. 1. Self-worth is non-negotiable. Never let someone determine your value. Cindy's greatest transformation happened when she realized she didn't need Daryl's validation. She only needed to see herself as enough. 2. Success is the best revenge. True power is not in retaliation, but in rising above the people who tried to break you. Cindy didn't destroy Daryl. His own actions did. She simply thrived, and that was enough. 3. Karma is inevitable. Betrayal always comes full circle. Daryl believed he had upgraded, but in the end, he lost everything while Cindy gained more than she ever imagined. 4. Strength comes from adversity. Pain is not the end, it's often the beginning of something greater. Cindy's suffering led her to the best version of herself. 5. Leaving is power. Sometimes the greatest power move is walking away and never looking back. Daryl only realized Cindy's worth when it was too late, proving that people only miss what they took for granted when it's gone forever. Final thought. God restores those who trust him. Cindy's story is a testament to how faith, resilience, and self-worth can turn even the worst betrayal into a stepping stone for greatness. She didn't need revenge, she needed to rise, and that was the ultimate victory. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.